Fire feels comfortable to a lot of people. It feels like a known, right? Like we all know often how to start a campfire or how to cook our food in some fashion. And so it's really easy to draw the conclusion that we as humans understand fire and combustion really well. But it's interesting because it's such a complex system, there's still quite a bit that's not understood. So when we push the limits of something and say, okay, in the vein of climate change, how is this going to burn differently? Or when we introduce a new building product, how is that going to burn? All of a sudden, there's like a whole new suite of questions when we might have thought that we understood fire really well before that point. So I think that's really cool about fires. It's continuing to surprise us, despite the fact that humans have lived with it for such a long time. My name is Yedinak, and I am a research fire scientist here with the U.S. Forest Service, sitting in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Laura Hasburgh. I'm a materials research engineer, and also located here at the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. I focus a lot on wood and how it burns and the material properties that change as it's burning.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to share your expertise. I thought we could just start off with the basics of just like what happens when we burn wood, and a little bit more specifically of just like how is that different from burning other things like ethanol or charcoal or even something like paper.
This is a fun question. We're going to start by playing with the word burning. You're going to hear us using combustion and combust instead because it's got a lot of precision inside of it. So the thing about wood that's interesting to start with is that it's a combustible solid, right? So that's when we were bringing up ethanol and other things along those lines, you're talking about a fluid of some kind that can mix in with oxygen really easily. Wood in particular has some components to it that combust really well, and some other components that require energy to remove them before combustion can really take hold.
Wood is a natural composite material, so it's made up of a lot of different things. It's this really amazing material that grows. It's a plant tissue. It is made up of polymers. There's lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose. The cellulose and hemicellulose are carbohydrates, so they're sugars, and those make up the majority of what wood is. But then there are other components. I think about 1% to 2% are minerals like calcium and magnesium. And then there's other extractives, what we call organic extractives, that are the things that make wood smell. So like different terpenes and fats and waxes, and they also add to the color of wood. And then there's variations between species and hardwood and softwood that change densities and other material properties. But in general, largely wood has an elementary composition of about 50% carbon, 6% hydrogen, and 44% oxygen, with trace amounts of other, like I said, metal ions or minerals. When you are burning wood, you're breaking apart those different polymers and those different components of the material itself in different ways to then support combustion in different really two different types of combustion processes.
Wood is different in every dimension. Imagine yourself being right in the middle of a block of wood. If you were to travel up and down, in and out, or left and right, you would have an entirely different experience. It's easy to make this assumption in our heads that it's like moving through a sponge, but in fact, it's got all of these different tubes and components to it that are aligned differently as part of the function of the tree. So that also makes it interesting when you're talking about burning, because like all of those pieces are aligned and it affects its porosity or how much airspace there is in between all of the solids as well.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people have experience with wood, whether it's in a bonfire type situation or something like that. And what happens when wood encounters heat. or fire, and it first really produces some steam and smoke, and so we can see that visually as it's happening. And then it ignites in those flames that we see, the different colors, the blues, oranges, reds, yellows. And then as the flames go away, we see those embers or the coals still existing and glowing. Then after that kind of goes away, then you see the ashes, and the ashes are really kind of the mineral component that didn't burn, or that were not combustible.
When you say mineral component, can you tell me a little bit more what you mean by that?
Sure. So, like I said, like wood is a composite material. So there's a lot of different elements within wood, but like I said, it's largely carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But there are some other minerals like calcium or magnesium that exist in it. So those components are not combustible, and it's a really small percentage, usually about 1 to 2%, depending on the wood species and growing conditions. Right, like there's a lot of variability that happens with wood, and part of what wood scientists study is that variability and what changes based on environment and growing conditions.
Just to be clear, because I feel like sometimes they're conflated. Char and ash are totally different things in your mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so ash is really that like non-combustible mineral component of the wood, that sticks behind, and then the char is the carbon from the polymeric components that either could still be undergoing, glowing or smoldering combustion, or will eventually be consumed because of smoldering combustion.
I don't know how your high school chemistry experience was, but it's like the tendency of wanting to put this in this like beautiful, neat and tidy chemical reaction that I feel like in theory sounds great, and in practice it's like way more variable and complex than what it actually is. You mentioned combustion, and then there also sounds like there's other processes going on too. Like, would you say that these are all kind of concurrently happening or somewhat sequentially? How many different reactions are really happening?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. There are reactions, uh, thermochemical reactions happening both at the same time, right, in parallel, but also sequentially. So it really depends on which snapshot of the process you're specifically talking about. Um, for instance, if we're talking about the polymers and in which temperature ranges those break down, they break down somewhat sequentially. So like hemicellulose tends to go first in lower temperature ranges, and then cellulose starts to break down, and then lignin is the last polymer to really break down. So that's where it goes sequentially. And then that means that those polymers contribute differently to the combustion process because they're happening at different times. Where like the hemicellulose is really providing a lot of volatiles that support flaming combustion. They're flammable gases and lighter compounds that are coming off and being released from the wood that support the flaming combustion. And then in turn, that kind of creates like a circular reaction, right? Where there's some external heat source, it's breaking apart these polymers, they're producing flammable gases that then support combustion, then creating more heat and more, increasing the temperature of the wood to then break down the next layer of a polymeric component. Um, but then, yeah, there's if you're talking about like different types of combustion, there's flaming combustion, smoldering combustion. So flaming combustion is the flammable gases oxidizing, and then smoldering combustion is the oxidation of the solid material. So really the carbon that's left behind, that black char that we see in wood.
So with that, is it safe to say that like something like lignin, is it generally breaking down from its like polymer form before combusting, or is it like also like the first part of that made me think yes, because you're like it's like breaking down, then you have these flammable gases and that's what's combusting, but then the smoldering piece sounds like that's it could also be.
Right. So the polymers are really kind of like heavy hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
And so they're too it's too much, right, to break down, right? So um they break apart into their little components, into lighter hydrocarbons, or tars or other things.
We've poured a bunch of heat in And at this point, if you were to look really, really close, you see all of these little components associated with the hydrocarbons that Laura's been talking about that are shaking violently. And they're still, if they're in solid form, they're still largely held together until a certain point when they reach a temperature where the bonds that are holding them together can't handle it anymore, and they start breaking apart in chunks. They don't look like polite little C's and H's floating about. They're these kind of funky combinations of things. And then at that point, they're hot. They're still shaking around a fair bit, and they're starting to come in contact with oxygen, right? So they're breaking apart, shaking, coming in contact with oxygen. Oxygen hits them. They've got electrons right around the outside of their structures that are really easy to grab. They're super energetic. They're throwing a big party out there at the end. And oxygen has these really cute little like quiet pockets deep down near the center of the atom that wants to receive an electron. It's got a spot waiting, right? So then that's oxidation, is when that electron moves from those more complex hydrocarbons or carbons, hydrogen, like nitrogen combos into the oxygen, and it oxidizes. And in that process, energy is released and it gets warmer when that happens, right? So like that electron shoots off a photon, and it's very energetic, and things warm up even further. And that's like the base piece of combustion, really, is that oxidation reaction. So it can happen in the air up above with, or in the fluid, if you will, that's the fluids coming off and components, or it can actually happen at the solid also, where oxygen's coming in contact with the charred material. And that's smoldering combustion when that's taking place with the solid.
Okay. So great. I'm so excited to catch. Like, honestly, to hear even that visual, like I could see it in my head. So thank you. In terms of different types of wood, like you mentioned, there's a lot of variability, it seems like, even within a single piece of wood, like a log. But how much variability is there in wood? And I guess how much does that matter when thinking about this process?
I'll start us off with just thinking about the porosity piece, right? So we talked about oxygen being a necessary part of combustion, right? It's the oxidation process. So the more space there is for oxygen penetration, the more porous it is, the more lively you can imagine the combustion process is as well. The other thing that you can imagine is that moisture being present in the wood has a big impact also. It likes to absorb all of that energy. It's not, and it's going to continue to absorb and absorb and absorb until it has become the steam that Laura mentioned earlier is part of what's coming off in the early parts of the combustion process as well.
Going back a little bit to, again, like those nice buckets that I think we tend to like to put things in. I feel like a big thing is like this idea of complete combustion and incomplete combustion. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, of like, are they happening concurrently? Is there a way to see which one is occurring more? How much do you care?
It really depends on the question you're asking, right?
Right.
Like scientifically. This is a tricky one. I think we've already, as we've been talking, you're getting the picture. This is like very complex, right? All of these things are interacting with each other. And Laura brought up that smoldering combustion is happening concurrently with flaming combustion up above. So we've got some solids interacting, some gases up above interacting. In a perfect world, if everything was perfectly complete combustion, you would have CO2 and water as your byproducts of combustion. That's it. Anything that's added in on top of that, now you're starting to see incomplete combustion. So if we were to take the entire, just the flame, not thinking about the whole combustion environment, but just the flame itself, and look just at the flame, we could see some places where there could be perfectly complete combustion going on in this tiny little spot, and over here, very incomplete combustion going on. And it's tied to how large the molecules are when they were coming off, what temperature everything's at, and how much oxygen is available, which is a huge component of this. It turns out that when you're burning wood or anything else in an open ambient environment, so we call that a diffusion flame. When you're burning in that open space, then you're subject to how much oxygen you can pull in or mix in as a result of that flame stirring everything up. And it's usually pretty slim amount of oxygen. It's an oxygen starved type of combustion. And so it's likely that you're going to have a significant amount of incomplete combustion.
Would you say it's around the same as like charcoal, or is that, I don't know, if you're comparing wood and charcoal?
Oh my gosh. So that's a really interesting question, because charcoal is a product from combusting wood, right? Like, in that case, what you're doing is you're warming something, you're warming the wood up sufficiently that you've driven off all of the main pyrolysates, and you're converting that wood over towards char, but trying not to get rid of the char. So you're trying to suppress smoldering combustion as much as you can, which also means suppressing flaming combustion as much as you can.
Yeah, the process of charcoal is very purposeful, right? Compared to char that might just happen in your bonfire, or, in our fire tests here, when we're looking at engineering, like engineered wood products, like cross-laminated timber, glulam beams. The char formation is, while very similar in the end to what charcoal is, the process of making charcoal is very purposeful.
One of the big differences, if you were to just take a piece of wood versus a piece of charcoal, maybe that came from the same kind of wood, and look at the two of them, the difference is largely that those lighter hydrocarbons and pyrolysates have come off at that point when you're looking at the charcoal, right? So it's actually received a lot of energy to be processed. So if you can warm it sufficiently to the point where it starts to combust, then it's going to have a higher temperature overall, because you've now, like, you're not sucking up a bunch of that energy to drive off more of the pyrolysates that you would have in the wood.
So it has like a higher ignition temperature.
It does,
but then once it's burning, then it's really releasing a lot.
Right.
Yes.
It's a very exothermic process. I mean, the heat is being given off, rather than an endothermic process where, like, the energy is being used to break apart those polymeric components.
One of the things that's really cool about charcoal, and one of the reasons why we have it and have had it for the longest time all over the country, thinking about like charcoal kilns that have been placed alongside railroad tracks, and the steam revolution, if you will, is because it's very consistent, right? It's lightweight. So if you process wood to the point where it becomes charcoal, then it's very lightweight, and the energy coming off of it is relatively consistent. It's not going to fluctuate wildly inside of the boiler that you're producing steam with. So it's part of the reason why when we cook, we choose to cook with charcoal as well, is because you're going to get an even heat,
Right.
as opposed to something varying quite wildly, which we experience more if you're trying to cook over a campfire while someone's continually putting new pieces of wood on.
In terms of smoke, like especially when it comes to barbecue, smoke is like the biggest thing in terms of adding flavor. And I feel like it's a totally different thing when thinking about like wildfires and other things. But could you talk a little bit about just like, what is smoke? Is that, you mentioned earlier that like there's both steam and smoke, I think, before combustion. So is it the product of some of that as well as incomplete? How complex is it?
It is really complex.
Yeah.
The smoke you're seeing is everything from chunks of carbon that could be like a simple piece of particulate matter. Particulate matter is a word you'll hear over and over again with smoke. And it's usually classified by size. So there's PM 2.5 and PM 10. That tells you the size of the particle, 2.5 microns or less, 10 microns or less. But then there's all sorts of other stuff that's in that smoke. Some of it is nitrogen based because there might have been nitrogen deposition on the material that you're burning. And so there's a nitrogen component to what's in the smoke. It really can be a quite diverse suite of things that's coming off, and dependent on what you're burning and where you're burning it.
So I'd love to know a little bit more about you and why you got interested in this job.
So my background, my undergraduate degree is in physics. And while I was in my physics program, I fell in love with thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, but didn't quite know where I wanted to go with it and went exploring around the world. I ended up at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, just looking for a science job, and was like, oh, this is it. This is it. This is fantastic. I had had the great opportunity to do a little bit of research in chaos theory also when I was an undergrad. And I felt like fire was kind of like pulling all of those pieces together, this really complex system. Thermodynamics was coming in and fluid dynamics was coming in. And I was like, this is it. This is the thing I want to do. And went on to get a degree looking in more with atmospheric science focus towards fire also, so I could get a better understanding of bulk fluid dynamics, not just at the local scale, but at the larger atmospheric scale also. And that just sealed the deal. It's just really fun. You can visually see it in front of you the entire time, which some people like, some people don't. And I like the challenge also.
I think I started off because I love buildings. I've always been really interested in architecture, and went to undergrad for architectural engineering. And by far my favorite class was fire protection engineering, and learning how to make buildings safe, both with automatic fire sprinkler systems, smoke detection systems, but also the passive fire protection systems. So that goes into like the fire resistance ratings of walls, floors, whatever, to separate compartments, ensuring stairwells are safe. Right. And so that's where I started dipping my toes into the world of fire protection engineering, and just kept finding myself asking questions about, like, why is the building code like this? Why am I doing it this way? And so I went back to school to dive a little further into fire protection engineering, and I have my master's in fire protection engineering. And then I was onboarded here at the Forest Products Laboratory, looking at specifically the reaction to fire of building materials, or wood-based building materials. And in doing that, I also worked through a PhD in material science and engineering, to really hone in on what's happening at the molecular level, or the material property changes that are occurring while these wood products are being exposed to fire, and how can we alter the chemical base, whether with a treatment or thermally modifying it in some way, or what can we do to the wood to make it react differently to the fire, maybe perhaps in a more safe way, or just better understand it, so that when we go to build buildings with wood, we're ensuring that they're being built properly, so that both life and property are are protected.
This is probably like a loaded question. I'm trying to think about how to simplify it a little bit, but just like in terms of like studying it or doing tests, like what does that kind of look like? I'm sure you could go into a lot of detail, but just trying to like, I know, visualize what does that look like in terms of how you're conducting tests, accounting for variability.
My favorite piece of equipment, I would say, that I get to work with is our furnace, which is a metal box that's lined with fire brick, just a high temperature ceramic. So it has flames coming from the bottom, and you can put your wood specimen, through it or on top of it as a lid, and really study the how the char is developing, the rate of char development, um, and how it's reacting to different fire scenarios. We can apply a lot of different fire scenarios within the furnace to see how, like, a glulam beam or a column might react to fire.
There are some studies that you're going to follow a standard technique that's been published and well used, documented. This is how this works, and this is the range of results you would expect from this standard test. And then because we're researchers, we push beyond what is known into the unknown all the time. So we might fiddle around with something ahead of time to say, okay, what should we expect off of this? Do we like, for example, this ignition? Does it make sense for the kind of question we're asking? Or does this technique for pulling or otherwise causing tension or capping the oxygen, how is that impacting our result? We need to think very carefully to make sure that we're going to get a result that gets at our goals. So we're oftentimes, we know how to light a lot of things on fire. We're very good at that, but we spend a significant amount of time thinking deeply about precisely beginning that experiment and fiddling with it so that we get what we want out of the fire. Yeah, it's one thing to start them. It's another one to start it carefully.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. I feel like I've learned a lot. I know students will be really excited about this as well. So thank you, really.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah.